Hello, listeners, and welcome to this week's mini-series. Something different for each of you listening, a crossover with another podcast. The WetWired podcast, hosted by Sean and Jules, is a podcast about conspiracy fantasies and realities, political goblins, spiritual degenerates, and other terrible things. The guys at WetWired were generous enough to record our chat, edit it, and send me the final results, which I am happy to be sharing with you all today. WetWired is available on all podcast platforms, and I will post the links to their show in the episode description. This mini-series is more of me diving into what I have learned over the last 3 years of interviewing survivors of cults and extremism, authoritarianism, and high-demand groups. But if you'd like less of that and more of survivors sharing their experiences, I will upload a lengthy bonus episode with author Mary Garden to complement the release of this episode today. Thank you so much for Sean and Jules for the work that you do and this conversation that we had. I look forward to catching up with you. And for anyone looking for a new show, I do suggest that you check this one out. A massive thank you and welcome to newest patrons and supporters of the podcast, Mac and Catherine. I appreciate both of you signing up to patreon.com/the Cult Vault, despite these very trying times that we are living in economically. I do hope that you enjoy access to exclusive content and join us for conversations on the Patreon platform. And thank you so much to those of you who are reaching out to me on Patreon and those of you who are supporting the show. I know that it's a big thing right now, and I don't take any of you for granted, so thank you so much. But for now, here are Sean and Jules, hosts of the WetWired podcast.
Welcome back to WetWired, everyone. I'm Sean Ondas.
And I'm Julian Paul Butt.
Today we're joined by Casey, the host and creator of the wonderful, very wonderful Cult Vault podcast. Welcome, Casey. It's great to have you with us.
Hi, Sean. Hi, Jules. Thank you so much for the invitation.
We worked our way through scheduling troubles and we managed to make it happen.
Yeah, we're pretty excited about this, for sure. This is going to be great.
So I'm going to pull a card out of your own deck, Casey, and I'm going to start off the show and by asking you if you could tell something about yourself to us.
Well, I am a full-time podcaster. It's my full-time job. I am a mother to 2 beautiful children. They are 2 and 3, and they are just magnificent best friends, and they keep me on my toes. I am Ciaran Warner, the investigative journalist, once told me that he's like a poor man's version of a cult expert, and I feel like I identify with that. And come September, I will be enrolling onto the Psychology of Coercive Control Master's course at Salford University to become an accredited cult expert.
Oh, so, that's fantastic!
So not quite of a poor version then.
The proper version.
Yeah, the proper version.
Hopefully at some point. I don't know if there has to be a doctorate involved for that, but we'll see.
Something that I noticed about your show, and I had been listening to it for a while before reaching out to you, but that the format has really changed since the earliest episodes, and I totally get how that goes. You know, everybody finds their feet in doing one thing or versus another, but you really started off as like a much more of a presentation type of show where you were researching topics and then presenting them, and like in a show format. And I just wondered how that transformation happened. Was it something that you intended to change, or did it come out just sort of on its own?
It's an interesting question, and it's probably one that I get asked the most often before interviews when I say to people,
right.
"Do you have any questions for me?" And they say, yeah, how did you get into this? And so I say this, which is almost scripted at this point. I started the podcast during lockdown. Our firstborn was 4 months old, and I was binge watching box sets on TV and thought to myself that I wanted to come out the other end of lockdown with something more than just an understanding of all the characters in the hit TV show Lost. So I started thinking about different things I could do. I tried baking, which didn't work very well, knitting, which I couldn't stick with, video editing, which I did enjoy, but the final product was so time consuming that I couldn't stick to that either. So I thought about doing a podcast, and I found a bunch of old notes that I had on unsolved mysteries that I just find absolutely fascinating. And my friend phoned me and said that she'd just finished reading Beyond Belief by Jenna Miscavige Hill, David Miscavige's niece, the current leader of Scientology. And she said it was fascinating. And there was so much more involved with the subject of cults than she first realized. So she was like, do a podcast on cults. And I said, well, that could be interesting. I don't know too much about the subject. I know a bit from things I've seen and shows I've watched. So I'll try that. And the original format was a deep dive researched approach where I put together a timeline of events on infamous groups, starting with the likes of Jonestown, and just telling the story from information that I could find online. And that went really well. And I was enjoying that. Despite a few issues with, Audacity stops recording halfway through, or programs crash and you lose all your work, and all the teething issues that you get when you decide to start a podcast.
We know those very well.
It's like heartbreaking, but I feel like if you can push through those first few issues, you can create some really wonderful stuff. And I was getting good feedback, and people were listening to my show outside of my family and friends, which, is the first big deal. And then I got contacted by an author named Helen Zuman, who had written a memoir called Mating in Captivity about her time on Zendik Farm. And I had never heard of Zendik before. And I had no idea that intentional communities could present in the way that Zendik Farm did. And I read Helen's memoir, and I was just blown away by the parallels between infamous cults that people like myself that typically don't know too much about the subject have heard about, and also these obscure groups that exist all around the world in these communities that people aren't even aware of. All the group of people that don't really socialize with anyone that live on the farm property up the road from us. So I asked Helen if she would be willing to sit down and interview with me, and she said yes. And I'd never interviewed anyone in that capacity before, and my back was dripping with sweat. And I think I spoke to Helen for about 5 hours because I really wanted to dissect her book with her. And she did. She sat down with me for just so long. And the episode was so well received that I began receiving emails from people around the world asking to share their stories, and that was it. The trajectory of the show completely changed, and now we are 255 episodes or so in, and I would say that 90% of those are interview-based episodes.
Oh, that's fantastic.
That is very impressive. That's a lot of episodes.
It's a lot. There's a lot of these stories, unfortunately. It seems like just a never-ending contact from individuals that want to share their story, which is amazing that people are taking their voices and having ownership over their stories in such a way. But of course, ideally, I'd love to run out of content one day.
Yeah. Well, that would be fantastic. I feel the same way. I wish there was nothing for us to talk about, because we tend to talk about mostly terrible things. Yeah. And in fact, that's become our new tagline, is a podcast about terrible ideas. And it really seems to be the thing that ties everything together.
Yeah.
But what you mentioned about these really small groups that just live on the farm up the road, is that the same thing as what's sometimes called like a family cult?
I would say sometimes I think that's the case. It depends on the dynamic of the group and the setup of the group. A family cult, I would say, is typically made up of a household of people where there are parents or parental figures and children that are being subjected to a particular set of tactics or manipulations that take away their independence, their critical thinking, and result in some type of indoctrination where a belief system is placed onto vulnerable individuals in a home. It doesn't have to be children, it can be other adults. We see in domestic abuse situations the intimate partnerships can be considered one-on-one cults or family cults if there's a number of people being subjected to that type of treatment in an insular environment in a home.
Mm-hmm. So it's a really small scale, but of the same mechanisms that we see in high control groups and typically cults, but probably other things too.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of these groups will tend to have more identifiable financial coercion and sexual coercion. Because the groups are smaller, the patterns of behavior, the controlling behavior is slightly easier to identify than with a large group setting where individuals are being financially coerced into giving 10-20% of their earnings to tithing, for example, where it's under the guise of religious practices. That is easier to explain to individuals in a way that doesn't feel coercive than it would be for somebody to take another person's bank cards or checkbooks, access their finances, keep receipts for everything, control what's ordered and bought inside the home, control what's eaten inside the home, ration food as a means of maintaining control over finances. I feel like in those types of environments, you might be able to really look at those situations and identify some of the controlling behaviors a bit easier than you would if there is a lot of other influence and rhetoric that's being used to justify other controlling behaviors that are taking place. But of course, it's not always the case that you would be able to look, and usually, typically, most individuals that aren't aware of this type of work would look at a family and say, wow, that looks like a cult to me. A family cult is a thing that is now becoming more widely recognized within the cult awareness spectrum, which is great, of course.
We did an episode about Nazi homeschoolers where it was this family that they were it wasn't rhetorically saying that they were Nazis in the way that word is thrown around.
They weren't getting called Nazis. They were referring to themselves as such.
Yeah, and they would homeschool their children, but control what their kids could see. There's absolutely no TV. It was the kind of information that was able to come in was so limited and on lockdown. Even their interactions with the outside world, they taught the children, hey, nobody's going to understand it, so you need to keep quiet to preserve the family and to preserve our integrity and everything like that. There's a lot of parallels there, but it's not a religion that they were doing. So we think of cults typically as a religion, but this one was some of the same mechanisms.
I think that's the difficult thing with a lot of cult media that exists in the world. It comes into the subject through a number of very limited avenues, although that is changing. And typically we see more cult media that is centered around religious groups. A lot of them exist, so it makes sense that that's the case. A lot of them are made up of large numbers of people. So again, that's another reason why we have a lot of people speaking out about their experiences. But homeschooling in itself, that can be an extremely coercive and controlling environment for vulnerable individuals with the information control that you've just spoken about. Bringing in extremist and radicalized beliefs on side of that. It works in tandem with that insular environment, with that information control, with that indoctrination of a child from a very young age who has no idea of what else exists outside of that environment. And what those two things in tandem do, the belief system and the enclosed environment, is it stops an individual from being able to access anything else. Because if you are restricted in making outside connections, where do you go if you decide that you do want to leave? It's a system that where all of the nefarious tactics complement one another to really psychologically and physically imprison an individual into that environment. So
Yeah.
Nazi homeschooling is it sounds like, yeah, extremely culty to me.
And even we talked with Steph Halmhofer about Atlantis and Brother 12. She brought up a idea called persecuted knowledge, where that seems to be a reinforcing mechanism that that we see, where you have this fringe belief, or it doesn't even have to be a fringe belief necessarily, but the idea is that you have access to this special belief and everybody else just doesn't get it. So the more that people say that belief is lopsided, it doesn't have evidence, it doesn't have credibility, the more persecuted you feel, the more justified you feel in your beliefs. Do you see some of these things, patterns like this in some of the cults that you've explored?
Yeah, consistently. That is one of the big us versus them methods that is used, whether it's from the pulpit or whether it's from a school study session, or whether it's in the knitting club up the road.
Yeah.
These us versus them mentalities, which are used to divide individuals inside the group from people outside of the group, will use things like not being understood, or being the chosen ones, and being holier than thou. And it creates this environment then that when something like social services come somewhere to check up on the children because there's been complaints, or there is an idea that some children might be being abused in some way in one of these environments, as soon as social services leave, that is the persecution. This is everything we told you would happen, and now it's happening. People don't understand our beliefs. They're trying to split us up. Awful things will happen to you if you get taken by social services. You'll be abused, you'll be murdered, you'll be sold, you'll be forced to sell drugs on the street. When ironically, often the things that vulnerable individuals are told will happen to them if they are taken by social services or by agencies that are trying to help people out of abusive environments, those things are happening to people inside the environments. But of course, they are being told that it's for the greater good, or it's God's will, or your role in this group is to, sleep with whoever the leader tells you to sleep with, or whichever controlling aspects are used within the particular group.
Well, that's something that we really encountered when we were learning about the Duggar family from the show 19 and Counting, which started off at 17 and Counting, and with the Advanced Training Institute, ATI. And it was the same sort of situation with the resistance to ever contacting any kind of outside authority, and then this sort of preloading this mistrust of governmental institutions in general. That they're, like you said, like all these terrible things are going to happen if you ever talk to any of these people. So, and very similarly to the preparation that we saw in the Nazi homeschooling family, the preparation for that was done to the children, just in case they ever did encounter people, to like, this is they're already prepped in advance about how to respond to questions from a social worker or a concerned teacher if they are actually in a public school, or just some other adult at a playground or something. And so they're very well prepared to either keep their mouths shut or to answer in very specific ways to preserve the secrecy inside the group.
Yeah, yeah. I remember specifically an interview I did with a survivor of the Children of God who talked about being coached into exactly what to say if social services picked up on the sexual abuse, the prolific sexual abuse of children that was taking place in the various communes around the UK and the world regarding the Children of God. And the deceivers yet true Bible verse was used to justify why you can't lie to us about anything, and you have to tell us everything, and you have to write notes that we can read and keep journals that we can read, and have public shaming ceremonies and gatherings where we expect you to lay out, all the sinful thoughts you've had, or all the extra, rations of food that you've eaten. Yet if somebody from the outside comes to you, you must lie to them to protect us and to allow us to continue our mission for God. And so deceive is yet true is a Bible verse that's been twisted and manipulated, as all of the Bible verses have been, to further the agenda of the respective group. And what you said there about the Duggar family, specifically the Advanced Training Institute, with the teachings around misogyny, is another thing that is happening in at the same time as the threats of things happening. So women are being subjugated horrifically within these environments and are being told, if you leave, you will be subjugated in these other environments whilst it's happening to them in real time. So it's a really difficult thing. And it's like Janja Lalich says, if there's a tapestry, everything weaves together to work. But if you can pull one thing and the whole tapestry comes apart, you are able to start recognizing all the different small, nuanced controlling mechanisms that are used to create that self-sealing system that is almost impossible at times to break free from.
With the cults, one thing that I really wanted to ask you, the word cult, this is going to sound pedantic for a second to get into the nitty gritty of semantics, but it is really fascinating to me where not that long ago, anthropologists and archaeologists perhaps and other people in similar fields would use the term cult simply to describe the rituals behind a group. And over probably, I think, during the 20th century, that term started to pick up a new connotation in popular culture and popular usage. I mean, it's still used in academic fields in that original sense. But one of the things I wanted to ask is, what do you think of your usage of the word cult? What does that mean when you're using it, and have you reflected on its meaning? Are there other words or other ways to think about cults other than how we've kind of come to this term in popular usage?
That's a really tough question, isn't it? I'm sure that the two of you have had this conversation and think about this in your own time as well. Absolutely, the term cult is still used to talk about ancient Egyptian groups that existed where people would be given to the sun god Ra. Lives would be, given in ritualistic sacrifices. People, anthropologists and archaeologists, they discover burial sites, mass burial sites today, even all of the time, where these sacrifices have taken place, and those rituals are considered part of cultic groups that were around during that time. And as you mentioned, over the years, the term changed to, in most dictionary definitions, to identify any type of religious group that is not traditional Christianity. So Christian Science or Jehovah's Witnesses would be considered cults by some mainstream scholars, by some dictionaries that still use that definition. And significantly after the events of Jonestown, the word really started to be used in a new context. There are some groups that you can look into, or that listeners can look into, of the early 1900s. Mayotus Blackburn was the leader of a group. I can't even. I mean, it was called the Blackburn Cult, but the official name was something like the Royal Arms of the Great 11.
There was so much swag in the late 1800s and early 1900s when it came to the naming conventions for these groups.
I mean, masters of wisdom.
Oh my gosh, they were just there was no sense of humility whatsoever.
Interestingly, Mayotus Blackburn took a lot of her teachings from Mary Baker Eddy.
Oh, of course.
Mary Baker Eddy.
Baker Eddy, yeah.
Mayotus Blackburn took a lot of influences from Mary Baker Eddy and actually wanted to join forces with her at one point. And Christian Science had taken on this whole life form of its own. So Mary Baker Eddy was kind of like, no, I'm not interested in that, but thanks for the offer.
I've got my own scheme running over here.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Which unfortunately is still in existence today. But the Divine Order of the Royal Arms of the Great 11 was a 1920s group where newspaper clippings say this woman was running a cult. So you do see it in the early 1900s being used in that sense, because it wasn't all religious. There was a lot of New Age influences, as we recognize from the work of Aleister Crowley taking place at that time as well. A lot of esoteric movements were picking up at that time. And today, after Jonestown, it's much more of a pejorative term that is used to explain various different groups: one-on-one cults, family cults, political cults, therapy cults, online cults. And it is difficult to not look at everything and say, oh, that looks like a cult, but also to recognize that the term itself is evolving as the world is evolving, because technology plays a huge part in how people now access extremist groups or get funneled into different types of online radicalization. So I don't know how I understand the word still. I often think to myself, is this a cult? And then I think about how difficult is it to leave? If you're in a group,
yeah.
If you were to walk away, what would be the consequences? Would you lose your eternal soul? Would you lose all of your family, friends, connection, social groups, community, job? If it's like a sect of Mormonism, typically those groups are so large and there are so many generations that all of the businesses, you need a roofer, you get a Mormon roofer. If you need your car fixed, you take it to a Mormon mechanic. So in those situations, if you leave a group like that, you also have no more work coming in for your job or your trade. So if you can't walk away and be unscathed in some way that truly damages yourself, your identity, your well-being, then I start to question, are there other things involved in that group that you could look at an expert's framework and it fits into what would be described as a cult? How I use the term is not very often on the podcast itself because of legal reasons.
Sure, you have a whole set of different considerations in the UK. Yeah.
Yeah, we I use the group I use the term group, movement, congregation, religion, home, family, but everybody that comes on the show decides whether or not they want to use that term, and that is down to their personal and independent decision making. And if an individual identifies with that term, then I think that that's more power to them after the experiences they've had respectively.
Yeah, I
That is
totally
really
agree
interesting.
about treating it as a one-off basis rather than a mass label, and that's really been where our resistance has been in just sort of haphazardly applying that to different groups. You know, using that particular label, and it also has it has another, there's another feature when you can just so easily name something that it's very easy to just disregard it at that point. Oh, that's another cult.
Yes.
You might as well just say like that's a group of wackos or something like that. And then even if their
All of the
behavior there
processing
might
stops.
all exactly. I mean, even if their general body of actions would justify calling them crazy, you don't think about it anymore. It's there's no further interest in understanding what's going on with this group or trying to reveal the dynamics that operate at the group level, and let alone the sometimes incredibly torturous experiences that happen at the individual level. And none of that. It's so easy to disregard. It becomes just a headline rather than a full exploration of the group and everything involved around it.
I had a patron message me that exact thing. She said to me, if we call everything a cult, then it really diminishes the stories that people come forward with when they use that word themselves. So it's difficult when you begin your journey of education into this subject, as I'm sure you've both started to recognize. It's difficult not to see the cultic elements of a lot of things in typical society that people would never even begin to think are cult-like. But also it's important to have that awareness that if we do overuse that word, it will lose its significance, as you've said, Jules. It's like it's almost like thought terminating cliches that are used in cults themselves.
Exactly. It is a very similar process. It is a thought terminating cliche. That's I think the one group that where we really had an issue with that, Jules, was when we were talking about the Raelians.
Yeah.
When talking about them, it's like there isn't this large collection of horror stories from individual members. There's definitely an exploitative component to it. There's definitely, a series of thought terminating cliches involved in it. There's a lot of control that's being applied to members from the top. And there's definitely a punishment for not following the rules that can be levied against people. But at the same time, especially when you look at it in this broader sort of neighborhood of other groups that are operating in with these dynamics, it seems to come up as much less of it with many fewer infringements on people than many of these other groups do, for whatever reason.
Yeah, and it was pretty. I mean, I would almost describe it as pretty tame compared to a lot of the other stuff that we consider.
As bizarre as their collection of beliefs are, they don't tend to result in the same sort of terrible histories that you find with other groups.
I think that's the difficult line. What you described there, Sean, with the list of restrictions and requirements, I would absolutely class that as cult-like. And it's part of my education coming to realize that even though groups don't always have a catastrophe or some hideous event that takes place, like the Branch Davidians with Mount Carmel, for example, if the 51-day standoff never took place with the Branch Davidians, people might have not realized who lived there and what was happening, but it was still a cult.
It was still a cult.
It was still, there was still things happening inside that compound that we just might never have heard about. The 51-day standoff that took place allowed the world to come to recognize what was taking place inside that building. But again, if a group is getting together for a book club and the leader of the book club says that people need to pay an upfront subscription, and the leader of the book club is collecting personal information on somebody and divulging it in a public setting, those are cult-like elements, but does that make the book club a cult? That's where
so
it's really
Goodreads
difficult.
is a cult. I get it.
Goodreads.
Well, I think Amanda Montell's podcast, A Little Bit Culty, she that's the type of episode that Amanda might put out, is like the cult of Goodreads, although she's an author, so maybe not.
She still wants those ratings, but that just shows the reach and the influence of Goodreads, which is Amazon anyway.
It's a really tough area and ground to cover in terms of how you use that term. But I think what has happened with the portrayal in media is that there does have to be some type of catastrophic event or a mass suicide or murder that creates this idea that that's what then allows it to be labeled a cult in the media. And I'm not sure that. So it is tough. It's a difficult one. Yeah. But the Raelia, that sounds culty to me.
It definitely did to us as well. Yeah. But the multi-level marketing schemes all seem cultish to me too.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Even though there's typically there's exceptions, but there's typically no religious component to them. I mean, you do get a religious component with some of the old ones, especially like Amway or something. But the younger ones, it might just be a financial objective, and everybody's bound together with this same sort of secularized prosperity gospel sort of type of mentality. But you still have this prevailing structure that binds everybody together, and again, there's a lot of punitive aspects to not following the rules, which mainly involve just getting ostracized. But when this is your group and you value your membership, getting ostracized has value.
And you could even have
Absolutely.
some, like you talked about, one that was really fascinating to me was the troubled teen industry.
Oh, yes.
You were talking to Meg Applegate, and there's not necessarily a religious component, but what's striking to me about that is in a lot of cases you have the cult where they're trying to be isolated and insular from mainstream society, but with the troubled teen industry, it's almost like a reverse card in Uno, where you're not fitting in with mainstream society, and so the mainstream solution, the I don't know, orthodox or institutional solution, is to send you to one of these places that are basically cult-like. They're using the same high control mechanisms, and absolutely horrendous, and not really based on science anyways.
Yeah, absolutely. The troubled teen industry, not only is the blueprint model based on a 1970s cult that did exist, which would be Synanon.
I was going to say, Synanon.
It is very cult-like in the way that individuals' leisure time and relationships are restricted, people's clothing and dieting is restricted, movements are monitored, stalls on the toilet doors are taken off, staff will perform cavity searches and strip searches on children and young adults. Every element of an individual's existence in those in those troubled teen industry facilities, wilderness camps, or therapeutic boarding schools is monitored down to when they go to the toilet, and that in itself is the most cult-like existence a person can experience. And of course, Jules, you mentioned that there isn't always a religious aspect, but there are religious-based troubled teen schools that do exist.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and Meg Applegate, probably one of the best people to talk to about this industry itself, in terms of Meg's personal experiences and her advocacy and education that she brings to the world. So what an amazing guest to have had on your show.
Yeah, that was a really fascinating one. Speaking of things that are not backed by evidence or a coherent model of reality, something that I found a lot in looking at some of the groups like these is that belief is accepted to be able to just trump expertise. That you can say, well, I believe it, and I think pluralism and embracing diversity gets conflated very often in our culture, in the Western world, where we value some of these, like in the UK or in the United States, we value some of these ideas of, you can practice whatever you want and you can believe whatever you want. That saying that you believe something has some kind of inherent value to it.
Yeah.
And then you can just use that to dismiss knowledge that is accumulated, from experts and people who actually know how this works because they spend their whole lives studying it. Do you find some of these? What kind of things like this do you find in studying these groups?
I think this manifests in many different ways across various different groups. You might see the Jehovah's Witnesses talk about not going to law enforcement with reports of abuse because their model of judicial continuance is best done by them who have the word of Jehovah than it is by law enforcement and the legal system that the rest of the world abides by. So this is one example that you see of groups saying we know better. There are things like the Lemurian Mystery School with Liana Shanti, an online figure at the moment with a very prolific following, who says we should cleanse and we should use coffee enemas and we should listen to my tracks on repeat. And if we do these things, we can overcome ailments. And if we speak to each other in certain ways, we can identify childhood abuse and overcome it by accessing my courses on recovering from certain things.
That sounds kind of like Kellogg. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I imagine most of the time professionals would look at those documents and say, this is absolutely not what we should be doing. If an individual has an eating disorder, or if an individual has psychological or mental health issues that need to be addressed by a professional, I don't think the approaches that are being used in certain online circles would be beneficial to the individuals that are accessing them.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It seems like alienation is such a huge component to both keeping people in these and even attracting outside members to groups like these, where you're looking for some kind of a sense of belonging. I mean, we see it with Reddit and 4chan and 8kun and places like this, where it attracts all sorts of people who are, I'm thinking of like incel culture, if you will, even just attracting these people who are feeling alienated, and all of a sudden they've got 10 other people that they're talking to that surprisingly feel the same thing.
Yeah.
Oh, there was that enormous kerfuffle that occurred among the incel community a few months ago because one of the most prolific members of the community revealed that he had sex. And immediately he was attacked by everybody because he abandoned them.
That is the end of part 1 of this mini-series with the WetWired podcast. For more on WetWired, I will post links in the episode description. And to get in touch with me, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or find me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast.